Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Having God's law and obeying it are two separate things. They shouldn't be, but that's how any set of rules and regulations work. They establish a set of guidelines or a code of conduct, but they cannot guarantee compliance. And nobody knew that better than Moses. He had been the one to receive the 10 Commandments from God on top of Mount Sinai. Then he had faithfully passed on those commands to the people. But over the years, he had watched as the people repeatedly disobeyed God's laws, even choosing to violate the first commandment prohibiting the worship of any other gods. Moses was fully convinced that the key to Israel conquering the land of Canaan and enjoying the inheritance promised to them by God was their obedience to God's law. So he begged them to not only remember those commands, but to keep them. Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children, how on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, "Gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so." And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you were going over to possess. Deuteronomy 4, verses 9 through 14. Moses knew what the Israelites were going to need if they were to be successful in conquering and possessing the land of Canaan. This was not going to be about strength of numbers, military prowess, or well-planned battle strategies. Their only hope of possessing the land and enjoying the many benefits it offered was tied to their relationship with God. And Moses knew that they were going to struggle with faithfulness and obedience. After all, as their leader for the last 4 decades, he had watched them repeatedly dishonor and disobey God. Moses realized that their entrance into the land would be only the first phase of their journey. God had commanded them to take full possession of the land, which would require that they completely dispossess all its current occupants. There were to be no exceptions, no treaties, and no compromises. But the people of Israel had a track record of doing things their way. They had a penchant for taking the easy path, and doing so always required a compromise of their convictions and a disregard of God's commands. So Moses reminds them of the day when God gave them his law, the 10 Commandments. It took place at Horeb, or Mount Sinai. It was there, in the early days after their exodus from Egypt, that God delivered to them a legally binding set of rules designed to establish his expectations of them. These laws would establish for them a black and white, non-negotiable code of conduct, a set of regulations and requirements that would set them apart from all the other nations on the earth. But before God had delivered his law to Moses, he had given him the following message for the people of Israel. "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. God had delivered them from their slavery in Egypt and had set them apart as his own. But it was not because they were unique or special in any way. They had not earned his mercy, and they did not deserve their unique status as his treasured possession. In fact, Moses would later clarify the undeserved nature of their status as God's chosen people. "For you are a holy people who belong to the Lord your God. Of all the people on earth, the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own special treasure. The Lord did not set his heart on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other nations, for you were the smallest of all nations. Rather, it was simply that the Lord loves you, and he was keeping the oath he had sworn to your ancestors. That is why the Lord rescued you with such a strong hand from your slavery and from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Understand, therefore, that the Lord your God is indeed God." Deuteronomy 7, verses 6 through 8. God had made a covenant with Abraham, and the fulfillment of that covenant involved the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham. By rescuing the people of Israel from their slavery in Egypt, God was keeping the commitment he had made to Abraham hundreds of years earlier. You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land. Genesis 15, verses 13 through 16. God had been faithful. He had done all that he had promised to do. But the people of Israel were still on the wrong side of the Jordan. They needed to cross over and take possession of the land, which is why Moses took the time to remind them of that momentous day at Mount Sinai, when God delivered to them his law. Most of the people to whom Moses was speaking would not have been alive at the time this event took place. They were the new generation of Israelites. So Moses went out of his way to describe for them the scene on Mount Sinai that day. And the book of Exodus provides us with even greater detail. On the morning of the 3rd day there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Exodus 19, verses 16 through 20. It was at the top of that mountain that God met with Moses and delivered to him the 10 Commandments, carved into tablets of stone by the very finger of God himself. And while Moses had been at the top of the mountain, the people of Israel had stood at the base, watching a spectacular display of God's power. Moses says the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. Deuteronomy 4, verse 11. The people of Israel heard the voice of God, but God himself remained invisible to them. And Moses recounts the content of what God had to say to the people that day. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. Deuteronomy 4, verses 12 through 13. God had demanded that the people keep the commands he was giving them. These were to be binding commands, not helpful suggestions. They were not up for debate. And Moses makes it clear that God had given him the responsibility to teach these commands to the people, that you might do them in the land that you were going over to possess. Deuteronomy 4, verse 14. In other words, the commands written on tablets of stone were to make their way into the hearts of the people, transforming the way they lived their lives. They were to be the guiding force in their lives, determining their relationship with God and with one another. While the God of Israel was invisible, his regulations regarding their conduct were not. They were carved into stone, and these laws were not man-made but God-ordained. Therefore they were righteous and holy. While the people of Israel could not see their holy God, they could demonstrate his glory through their own holy conduct. By living according to his revealed law, the people of Israel could display his glory and goodness to the nations around them. Their compliance to his law would set them apart from all the other people groups living on the face of the earth. They could make the invisible God visible by living in accordance to his commands. And as Moses stated earlier, by watching Israel live in obedience to God's commands, the nations would express their awe and wonder, which is why Moses had called the people to obey them willingly and completely. Obey them completely, and you will display your wisdom and intelligence among the surrounding nations. When they hear all these decrees, they will exclaim, "How wise and prudent are the people of this great nation! For what great nation has a God as near to them as the Lord our God is near to us whenever we call on him? And what great nation has decrees and regulations as righteous and fair as this body of instructions that I am giving you today?" Deuteronomy 4, verses 6 through 8.